All right, so immigration and border security. It's been in the news a lot lately,
Mhm.
and maybe you're feeling a little lost trying to figure out like what's really going on.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a deep dive today and try to unpack Tom Homan's first week back
Mm,
as the border czar. You've probably heard of him. He's known for being very blunt,
mm.
and he's got very strong opinions when it comes to immigration enforcement.
Yeah, he doesn't really hold back, does he? He's definitely a controversial figure. He's worked in both Republican and Democratic administrations. He's got over 3 decades of experience with immigration enforcement. And this time around, he's laser focused on what he sees as like the most urgent threats. People who pose a risk to public safety, national security, and organized criminal gangs,
Yeah.
especially MS-13.
Yeah, he seems to be moving pretty quickly. Laying out his priorities, it seems like his main goal is to deport as many of these individuals as possible.
Hmm.
And he's made it very clear that more funding will lead to more deportation. So how does that actually work in practice?
Well, one of the more controversial aspects of Homan's approach is something called collateral arrests.
Collateral arrests.
Yeah, so basically it's when people get caught up in an ICE operation, even if they weren't the original target.
So, like, they're not the main focus, but they get arrested anyway.
Exactly. Homan's argument is that when ICE can't detain someone in jail, maybe because of sanctuary city policies, they have to go out into communities to make the arrest, and that just increases the chances of these collateral arrests happening.
And we saw this happen just last week in Chicago, right? With Homan's operation there. He says that almost everyone they arrested had a criminal record, including some really serious offenses,
Hmm.
like sexual assault and even murder.
Right, he's been talking a lot about these 2 convicted murderers
Hmm.
who were released by the state but then picked up by ICE. His point is that every single person they arrested during that operation was a real threat to public safety. But he has admitted that there were also several collateral arrests made during that sweep.
Okay, so that's interesting. But he's also been critical of the previous administration's deportation numbers. He says they're misleading because most were border apprehensions, not what are called interior removals. Could you break down the difference between those two for us?
Sure, a border apprehension is when someone stopped trying to cross the border illegally. An interior removal is when someone is already living in the U.S. and is then deported by IC. So Homan is saying that while border apprehensions were high under the previous administration, interior removals were actually historically low, despite what was going on at the border.
So he's saying that there wasn't enough enforcement happening within the country. And it's also not backing down on his stance when it comes to what he calls sensitive locations, places like schools, hospitals, and churches. He says if they're harboring security threats, they're fair game for ICE. And he even used the example of MS-13 gang members being found in schools.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously going to cause some controversy. Hallman argues that ICE is no different from the FBI or the DEA. They're all just focused on national security. But his critics say this is going to create a climate of fear in immigrant communities, and it could damage the trust between these institutions and the people they're supposed to be serving.
It's important to understand where he's coming from, though. He's talked about a really disturbing experience he had years ago, finding 19 dead migrants in a truck, including a 5-year-old boy. That must have had a pretty profound impact on him.
Oh, absolutely. That experience is a huge part of why he's so passionate about border security. He wants to prevent those kinds of tragedies from happening. And he gets frustrated with what he sees as a lack of action from Congress. So it makes sense that he's so intense and committed to this issue.
And we saw that intensity firsthand. During a clash he had with a congressman recently, he actually said, "You work for me, I'm a taxpayer."
Hmm.
That moment really seemed to capture people's attention on both sides of the immigration debate.
Oh, yeah, it definitely went viral. I think that exchange shows just how strongly people feel about Homan. He's got his supporters and he's got his critics, and they're both very passionate.
Another thing that stood out from his first week is his stance on international cooperation. He's saying that under this administration, other countries will be more willing to work with the U.S. on deportations than they were under the previous administration. He says it's because of the administration's America First approach and their willingness to use stronger tactics.
Hmm. Yeah, that suggests a possible shift in U.S. foreign policy, maybe a more assertive approach toward countries that aren't seen as cooperating on immigration.
And that assertive approach is definitely on display with the reinstatement of the Remain in Mexico program. He also just announced that all CBP appointments for asylum seekers are canceled. And he's telling people to apply at embassies instead.
Wow, so that's a pretty big change. Basically, it means people seeking asylum in the U.S. will have to wait in Mexico while their cases are processed. It definitely raises some questions about due process and access to asylum.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. We've gotten a sense of Hallman's priorities, his very direct style, and the impact he's having. But this is just the beginning. How are these policies actually playing out in communities across the U.S.? We're going to dig into that in part 2 of our deep dive.
Well, one area where Homa's policies are having a big impact is on families. He's been very vocal about defending the family separation policy. He says it's a deterrent to illegal immigration. He believes separating families is just like a consequence of upholding the law.
Right, he's even compared it to, like a parent being separated from their child during a DUI arrest. But critics argue that seeking asylum is legal, and these families are often running from really dangerous situations. They say that separating families is incredibly traumatic, and that it has really devastating long-term consequences.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complex issue. Homan often points to the dangers migrants face on their journey. He talks about his own experience finding that truck full of dead and injured migrants, including that young boy. He says he's trying to save lives and prevent more tragedies.
And he also argues that open borders would lead to more deaths. He's adamant that we need strong deterrence. He believes that the law needs to be enforced. And he gets frustrated with people who criticize his methods without offering any solutions.
Right. I mean, you can see how his approach appeals to some people, especially those who want stricter border control. But his policies have also been condemned by human rights groups and immigrant advocates.
One of the main concerns is the increased use of the military. We're seeing military planes being used for deportation flights and troops being deployed to the border. Homan says this is necessary to reinforce enforcement efforts and send a message that the border is closed.
But critics question the cost of using the military for this. They say it just makes the border more militarized, and it creates this atmosphere of fear, which could actually hurt border communities and asylum seekers.
Yeah, and then there's the issue of funding, which is really at the heart of all of this. Homan has said he needs more money from Congress to do his job effectively, especially for things like detention beds and transportation. He thinks that the recent election shows that the public supports these measures.
This really highlights the role of Congress in shaping immigration policy. It's going to be interesting to see if he can get the funding he wants, given the current political climate.
It will be interesting to watch. He's also targeting what he calls recalcitrant countries. These are countries that refuse to take back their deported citizens. Homan thinks that under the current administration, these countries will cooperate more because of increased pressure and the America First agenda.
So that could mean a shift in U.S. foreign policy, more focus on using leverage to achieve immigration goals. I guess we'll have to wait and see how effective those tactics actually are, and if they end up hurting relationships with other countries.
We can't forget about the human impact of all of this, though. These policies are affecting real people's lives. Homan has said that not everyone who is undocumented will be deported. He says resources are limited.
But he's also said that anyone in the country illegally could be deported.
Okay.
That creates a lot of uncertainty and fear, especially when he says things like people need to look over their shoulder and start packing. I mean, that's got to be terrifying for people.
Absolutely. So we've looked at some of the immediate effects of Homan's policies, the increase in deportations, the potential for collateral arrests, and the fear among immigrant communities. But what about the long-term consequences? What kind of lasting impact will these policies have? We'll try to answer those questions in part 3 of our deep dive. We've been talking about Homan and the impact his policies are having. But what about the big picture? What are the long-term consequences of all this?
One concern is that immigrant communities are going to be living in fear. When people are afraid to report crimes or go to the doctor or even send their kids to school, it makes everyone less safe. And people lose trust in institutions.
It's not just the undocumented immigrants themselves who are affected, right? It's their families, their friends, their entire community.
Exactly. This is where Homan's critics say his policies are actually doing more harm than good. They say that by creating this climate of fear, he's making it harder to address the root causes of illegal immigration and crime.
Like when he canceled those CBP appointments for asylum seekers.
Yeah.
And told people to apply at embassies instead. Critics are worrying this is going to make it way harder for people to actually get asylum.
Right. It could limit the number of people who are allowed to legally enter the U.S. to seek asylum. And that might push more people towards those really dangerous migration routes. It's a complicated issue with a lot of potential downsides.
And what about the economic impact? I mean, immigrants are a huge part of the U.S. economy. Mass deportations would definitely have a ripple effect.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Especially industries like agriculture and hospitality. It makes you wonder what the overall impact will be on communities and the economy as a whole. Deportations don't just affect the individual. They affect businesses, families, entire communities.
So where do we go from here? Homan's back and he's shaking things up. His hardline approach and his focus on enforcement are going to have a lasting impact.
It's a really tough situation. Immigration is such a complex issue. It's emotional. And Homan's definitely adding fuel to the fire. I think we need to approach this thoughtfully, recognize the human stories behind the statistics, and really think about the long-term consequences of the choices we make as a nation.
This deep dive has given you a glimpse into Homan's first week back, his goals, and the potential fallout from his policies. But the conversation doesn't end here. We want you to keep thinking about these questions. What do you think the next few months will be like for undocumented immigrants and for communities all across the U.S.? Keep learning accessions, keep asking questions, and come to your own conclusions. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.